Pretty impressed that the room is still this full at 4 p.m. That's pretty amazing. Well done. And I also know that this time of the day is one where people's brains are kind of done and turning off a little bit. I've been to Synod Assembly before. So that's why we give so much content in the morning session this morning, just to kick it off. So this afternoon, we're going to do a little bit more discussion at tables and a little bit more of processing of what we're thinking about. So just to prepare you for that. So we are still in Luke this afternoon. I mean, after all, it's the gospel for this lectionary year. And you remember from this morning that we are still on the move, on the road. So we might as well use Mr. Rogers' neighborhood trolley as just an image to keep in our heads of Move Me. You know, if you watch, there's a new version. Those of you who don't have little children may not know this. It's a cartoon version called Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, and they're able to continue a lot of the same themes, but they do it animated. And what I like about that is that Daniel Tiger and his little friends use the trolley to ride around. And so that's how they actually get out into the neighborhood, is the trolley. So we'll be thinking about that movement out into the neighborhood. Well, that's in the background, and it's a good image for us, but we're going to engage a different section of Luke. So we just had Easter, and we are still in Easter. Yes. So we had our great Easter celebration festival, and then for the next several weeks, we'll be continuing to talk about what it means that Jesus is risen. So we'll start today in Luke 24, because the resurrection narrative that takes place, if you follow the lectionary, that would be the one that you read on Sunday, the one where early in the morning the women go to the tomb, and the young men are there, and they say to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Always a good question for us. You know, sometimes we seek the living where it is not. We seek it in the place of the dead. And after that, then, the story continues. And we get to the evening, and we get this next story. Sometimes this text is appointed for the third Sunday of Easter, and sometimes it's appointed for Easter Sunday evening. Did anybody go to church on Easter Sunday evening? No? Oh, good. So I'm not doubling up on anybody's preached experience. That's good. So we're going to talk about this part of the text, which takes place at the end of the day, as some disciples of Jesus are on the road. They are on the move. They're moving. We don't know who these disciples are. We learn later in the text that one of them is named Cleopas, but since he never shows up anywhere else, that doesn't really help us very much. The other person remains nameless. We don't even know that person's gender, like in theory. What we do know is that they are disciples and that they are talking to one another. Luke 24:13. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that have happened. So they are disciples and they are informed. They are people who have followed, and now they're people who are trying to deal with what has happened. This is interesting because the verbs that are used in this sentence and then in the next verse that follows have an intensity about them. This is not like a, "So what do you think?" kind of conversation. This is a deliberation. In some ways it has an edge, almost like a heated conversation where there may even be some disagreement between the two of them. There's an intensity here. They are talking about important and difficult things. And sometimes I think that we have this sense that church should be the pleasant place. Church should be the place where everybody's nice to one another and we can talk about relatively easy things, or at least that's the way it ought to be. But as Bishop Eaton reminded us in the video earlier today, the church is one of the places left where people who disagree are still in formal and informal relationship with one another. So this kind of conversation is characteristic of our churches. So if you've ever been a part of a church where people have disagreed and yet somehow still come to the rail together, congratulations. You are being church. And we see that in these two as they're walking on the road and they're on the way. We see them modeling this, being the church in the world. So, on the road, on the way. Let's talk about roads. I'll do next slide. On the road and on the way. This is a picture of a Roman road, and it's in Sepphoris, which is in Galilee. I think old things like this are incredible to me because, of course, you can see the grooves from the wagons. Real human beings pulled and pushed things and worked with livestock and animals to move things along these actual roads. That's always really humbling to think. They're not so different from us. So I have this picture because it was part of the Holy Land trip that I was on. And I have this picture in particular because I was really interested in this town of Sepphoris. It's a town in Galilee, like I said, and it's near Nazareth. It was built by Herod Antipas. You know, there's two Herods, and it gets kind of confusing sometimes about who the Herods are and what they're all about. So there was a Herod the Great. He's the one that, that you can just remember. Like, he's the big one. He's the patriarch. Let's just use that word from one we had before, right? So Herod the Great, when he died, had children and a will, and he wanted to divide up his territory among his children. And in order for this to happen, Caesar Augustus, not baby Gus Gus, but Caesar, Caesar had to read the will and make sure that that's what he wanted to have happen, because he was really in charge. But what ended up happening is, so one of Herod the Great's sons, name is Archelaus, got to be in charge of Jerusalem and Judea. And another one of his sons, Herod Antipas, got to be in charge in Galilee. Archelaus, it turned out, was a terrible ruler. Now, admittedly, it's kind of a hard place to be in charge of, but he was really bad. So he was removed, and that's why you have a Roman governor named Pilate who's in Jerusalem. So Archelaus is gone, and Herod Antipas is still in charge in Galilee, one of the sons of Herod the Great. It could be that he possibly had some inferiority issues when it came to his father, because his father had this great city on the coast, Caesarea Maritima, that he had built. And so Herod Antipas builds this Roman city in the middle of nowhere in Galilee, in Sepphoris. So when you go there, it's odd because it feels very cosmopolitan, it feels very Greco-Roman, and it's literally like a 5K from where Jesus was in Nazareth. Sometimes people say to me, I'm not sure I buy this whole thing about the Romans and then Jesus. Like, how much would somebody like Jesus would have even known about the Roman Empire or this presence? I'm going to bet more than we think. Because if Herod Antipas was building this place and all these nouveau riche people needed their buildings built, who were the carpenters? Who were the stoneworkers? Who were the people from the area who came to build? So a Roman road for me is a symbol. It's a symbol of what that dominant culture meant in Jesus' day. Roads are really important. Roads are part of what connect the neighborhoods together, right? They're part of what make us connect to each other. And so real people needed to use them for real reasons. What's the impact of Luke telling a story about people walking along a road, along the way? Well, first, Eric Barreto says, and I really like this, this is like an initial story of who the church is. This will be a church on the move. This is not going to be a church that stands still. This is a church on the move. They were going somewhere. Second, roads are really important in the Roman road. They're ubiquitous. Because Rome had to have roads. They had to have roads to transport all that stuff that people would grow that they wanted to take. They had to have roads in order to move the military, because they need to get their legions from here to there. So roads make a big impact in Rome's ability to be the empire. So roads are everywhere. They're also dangerous. They're liminal space. Do you know that word? Liminal, it means in between. Dave Matthews, right? The space between. Yeah, they're the space that's in between one place and another place. So because of that, there's a vulnerability about being on a road. You're not where you were, but you're also not where you're going. So this, for Luke, is where we tell the story. The two people are talking to each other. They're on the way. They're on the road. They're in the middle of a much bigger world. They are not yet where they will be, but they are not where they have been. This is where they engage one another. This is where they're having this intense discussion about what it means and what has happened to Jesus. Fourth, lots of people have talked about this. Most recently, I read it from Sarah Henrik. The road, the way, is where we spend most of our lives, rather than where we used to be in one spot or where we're going in another spot. We spend most of our time, not just Bishop Gronberg, we spend a lot of time in the car, on the road, going from place to place. Full disclosure, I did not write these Bible studies sitting in my study with big leather-bound books and a cup of coffee. No, I wrote them on my phone in the dance lobby of the studio where my kid takes class, right? I thought and imagined them as I was driving around Fort Worth for the 90th time to bring a kid to yet another activity. This is where life happens. This is where ideas come to us. This is where we do our work. We are on the way. It's very rare, actually, for us to have a settled feeling. Instead, we are constantly on the move. It's not just Bishop Gronberg, and it's not just parents of young children. We have this sense of mobility and movement in our lives. I haven't done it. I don't know if you can run an app to see, but I would venture to bet that the most often sent text message from my phone, on the way. Yeah. I'm saying to somebody, I'm really, really almost there. I'm so sorry to keep you waiting, right? Or I'm saying to my husband at the end of the day, counsel is done. I am on my way. We are always on our way. This is literal, but it's also figurative. It's metaphorical. What does it mean for us to spend so much time in between? That's where Jesus' disciples are. Okay, next slide. We continue. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." This is the part of the text where they are on the way and they get to talk to Jesus, but they don't know it. It says that their eyes are kept from recognizing him. They are not able to see that it's in fact Jesus. This is fascinating to me. There's some things to note here. What happened at the cross didn't stay at the cross. Yeah, because they say to him, "Are you the only one who doesn't know?" The story of what had happened had already begun to move. It had already begun to go into that space between. It had already gone out into the neighborhood, right? And what had happened in Jerusalem didn't stay in Jerusalem, because as these people walk, they're telling the story, they're engaged, they're thinking about it. So there's something about the power of the story that immediately begins to move. Are you the only one who doesn't know? Apparently it got around very quickly. Next slide. The phrase that stands out to me the most, though, in that part of the text, and really the whole one, is the phrase, "We had hoped." We had hoped. That's a heavy thing to say. It's hard enough to articulate our hopes before they happen. It's really hard to articulate them after we know they're not going to happen. We had hoped that this would be the case, but it's not. This is a picture of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. As you come in, I've only been once, but as you come in, on the right are the steps that go up to Golgotha. And then in front of you is this area, which is traditionally said to be the place that they laid the body of Jesus. And other things you kind of have to wait in line to do. This one is sort of out in the open. And so people will spend a long time in the day that I was there in devotion and prayer and sort of keeping vigil in that place. It's beautiful, but it's loud, it's chaotic, there's a lot going on. But there's a lot of sense, I thought of this picture immediately when I read those words. We had hoped that they, the two disciples along the road, had hoped that something would be true of Jesus that was now not going to happen. Even if God was going to do something new, what they thought was going to happen is not going to happen. And that phrase, "we had hoped," carries so much weight behind it. I think it is the same for us, that we have things that we carry around with us that we had hoped would happen that are now not going to happen. And they're hard to talk about, and they're kind of heavy. But we also know that we won't be able to move on until we're able to articulate them. I think this is true in our personal lives, but I also think it's true of us as churches. We had a certain narrative or a certain idea of how we had hoped things would go, And when they don't, we have to decide when we're willing to let go and what we're willing to say about what happened. We're not going to stay in this place because this is kind of sad. But I want to sit here because this is part of what the church does in honoring these things that we had hoped would happen. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to share with some people around you about something that you could relate to about this phrase that we had hoped. Maybe it's something from your personal life. We're all into feelings today with Mr. Rogers, so go boldly, yeah. Or it might be part of your church, might be part of your congregation, might be something from your professional life, something that you had hoped would happen that is not going to be the case. I'll go first. Next slide. This is a picture from Assembly 2017, but it could have been from any assembly of the last 30 years. This is Doug Perrin, who's a member of my congregation at Trinity, long before I got there. And he was what I always called the engineer of assembly. Doug's organizational expertise was put to use by our synod for decades. He facilitated all the details. People would have great ideas, and then Doug would have to figure out how to actually make that happen in facilities and negotiating with hotels and ballrooms and all this stuff. And when I think of him at assembly, I think of him with that clipboard, right, in the corner, answering questions, anticipating the need that was next. Earlier today, I did something I really didn't want to do. I wrote Doug's name in the Book of Remembrance because he died last summer. I had hoped to see him here again this year. He was sick last year, so couldn't be a part of assembly. I had hoped that he would be a part of the ministry of my congregation for years and years to come. I had hoped that there would be some sort of future relationship here in this life, in this realm, that would be fruitful and holy. But it is not to be. I still say goodbye to Doug when I leave church on Sundays, because he was almost always one of the last ones, because he would help make sure everything from the altar got put away. And I can't help it, because I had hoped there would be much more of a relationship to come. And so, I'd like you to take a minute at your tables and to talk to the people around you. What is something that you or your community had hoped that is not to be? This is really holy work, so I encourage you to listen to one another. 1 minute. Thank you for spending this time in conversation with each other. Everybody's still talking. Let's let them go. I'm looking out to see how many people have their phones in their hands to signal they're done. All right, let's bring it back into the conversation. I know you could probably go longer. Thank you for trusting each other with these kinds of stories and having this sort of interchange and discussion with one another. I think it's worth noting that for the people in the story, it is the fact that what they had hoped did not happen that got them moving. It was the fact that they had hoped for something that was not to be. That was the reason that they were on the road and they were on the way somewhere. And I think that's what can be the result of us coming to terms with what we had hoped would be and is not going to be any longer. That's when we talk about resurrection. So on the road, on the way, talking about what they had hoped would be, got them moving, and that is when we meet Jesus. That is when Jesus is present. So they're in the middle of their discussion here with Jesus, their report to him. Besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. This is pretty incredible. I have to say, I'm holding out for this day that Jesus shows up and explains it all to me. And I won't even have to write it down anymore. I'll just turn on my phone, and I will have it recorded that Jesus will be able to explain to me what is going on and why it needs to be this way. What a great day that will be. Maybe. Maybe I don't want to know. But it is on this way, as they're talking to Jesus, they reach the limit of their understanding. And then Jesus responds. And in responding to them, he understands that they have a limited amount of understanding. They have a limit, they're confused. They're not going to be able to understand exactly what's happening. So he takes it up and continues the story. It's interesting because they tell it so well. They're like, well, the women said, but they didn't see him, and are we supposed to believe them? This is all very complicated. How much do we take the word of the people around us? When does it have to happen to us? Right? We're going to talk about Thomas this weekend. Jesus enters into that space, that liminal place, on the way, the space between, the place where we don't know, the confusion and the limits, and that is where Jesus shows up. I like this idea, this concept of the liminality and the space between. Next slide. So one of my favorite stories about Doug Perrin, and the one I told at his funeral, is about the day we visited Dheisheh refugee camp. When we were in the Holy Land, my congregation from Trinity went, and this is basically near Bethlehem, in the West Bank. And we went to the refugee camp, and I didn't, if you really want to know anything about the Holy Land, please do not ask me. We have like an actual expert in the back of the room, Dr. Robert Smith, you can raise your hand. So don't ask me about anything that's actually political or important. But here's what I understand. So Palestinians fleeing their homes during the war in 1948 couldn't go back home. And so they created a refugee camp, a temporary place for people to live, for Palestinians to live in 1948. They are still there. Is there something called permanent liminality? Like the permanent in-betweenness? I think for them, yeah. And so we went to visit this place, and we were walking around, and every step I took in the Holy Land, I felt like everything got more complicated. And I felt like I was overwhelmed, and then we would eat, and then we would go someplace else, and then there was a whole new dimension that I'd never considered before. And as we were walking on the road together in Dheisheh, the bishop and I and Doug Perrin were sort of at the back of the group as we were walking. And I was talking with Doug, and we were talking about how heavy everything felt and how overwhelmed we were, because there was a sense of, I'm certain that they had hoped things would be different. And they just never are. They're always the same. And it was deeply touching for Doug, and we had a very good conversation about it. And you reach the end of the conversation because you're confused and you're limited and you want Jesus to show up and explain to you what could possibly be done. And then I will do that. We're having this conversation, and instead of Jesus, or maybe it was Jesus, a little boy came up to us, and the question is asked, "Where are you from?" And the bishop says, "Texas." We are from Texas. And Doug and I look at each other and smile, because Doug and I are not from Texas. I mean, there's a complicated story here. The bishop is from Texas, yeah. But okay, we're from Texas. And so we ask back, smile, "Where are you from?" And he says, "Dheisheh. I'm from here. I'm from the space between. I am not where my people have been, and I am not where my people will go. I'm growing up here, in the liminality." And man, that was big. It was profound. And to think of people spending their entire lives in this in-between space, talking about people having had hopes, and things are not to be what they had hoped. In no way do I want to diminish the lived reality of those people. In fact, I want to highlight it. That's the point of telling the story. But I do want to say that I think there's a way for us to relate to this in some small way. Because in our theology, we can talk about the now and the not yet, which means that Jesus has come once, has lived, has died, rose again, and has promised to return. And the entire span of the church has been lived in the waiting of that. That we are in the now, but then there is the not yet. We talk about having no abiding city, right? When someone dies, my childhood pastor would get up, Pastor Delmar Carlson, and he would say, "We have no abiding city," and everyone would be quiet because they wanted to hear who had died. We have no abiding city, but we seek one that is to come. We live in an in-between place. It's called being human. And we are not where we have been, and we are not where we will be. And I think a little taste of that allows us to have empathy for our neighbors. Because every day people are displaced. Every day people become refugees. They leave where they have been, and they are not where they will be. And that is where Jesus shows up. The space between, the place where we leave behind the things that we had hoped, and that Jesus will find us. Okay, next slide. The final part of the story. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" But that same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. I find it interesting that they're worried about Jesus. Like, they don't want him to go on. They don't know it's him. It's like he's already died. What's going to happen? Right? But of course, they don't know it's Jesus. So when he's going to go ahead onto the dangerous road, right, ahead into the night, they say, no, stay with us. We will be your hosts. And they invite him in. And that's a beautiful moment because the host becomes the guest, and the guest becomes the host as Jesus reveals himself to them. Where? As the bishop said earlier today, at table. This is where Jesus finds us. And so he stays with them, and then they recognize him. Then they understand that it's been Jesus the whole time. They thought they were being hospitable, and they were, but they were hosting the one who really hosts us all. God is always the host. After Jesus disappears, they rush on and back to Jerusalem. The disciples, in the meantime, have seen Jesus, or at least Simon has, and they'll believe Simon, even if they didn't believe the women. So we're good now. Yeah. So they have decided that they have evidence that Jesus has been raised. So they come back and they tell them, not only has Simon seen him, but so have we. And now there is a story to be told from when they were on the road. I love that line. Yeah? He told what had happened on the road. When we leave things behind that we had hoped, we're moving forward into the neighborhood. And that's when Jesus meets us, and we will have a story to tell of what happened to us when we were on the road. That's a beautiful thing. I'll take the last slide. So the guest, Jesus, becomes the host. And the stories that they tell from the time on the road change. The two go from being storytellers of grief to storytellers of hope. That what had hoped would happen is not going to happen. And now there is a new hope. This is not in any way to disparage storytellers of grief. That's part of what we do as the church, and it's really holy, like I said before. But when they come side by side, then we can see the work of God in both. So they become the storytellers of grief that give way to storytellers of hope, of what God will do next. We are not only the people who had hoped. We are the people who still hope. We are the Easter people, eternal hope. What happened with Jesus didn't stay in Jerusalem even for a couple of hours. It had already spread, and down through the centuries, from Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth to Texas, someone has told. And when you were baptized and the candle was given to you and the light came to you and the story became yours, then you become a storyteller of the things that we had hoped, but the things yet to come, that we are on the move, the stories that God gives us. Lots of people have pointed out in this story that we've just read kind of the shape of the story that relates to worship. There's like a proclamation of the gospel, there's a deliberation about what Scripture means, and then there's a meal. That sounds like church. And there's a nice framework there to think about what we do when we're on the way, when we're on the road and Jesus meets us. Kind of a nice way to think about what we do on Sunday morning in that inhale time when we all come together. that we encounter Jesus on that way. We experience the deliberation and the questioning, and we share the meal together, and that is when Jesus is revealed to us. I'm not talking about this story today, but I love the fact that Mary says it so succinctly. I have seen the Lord. That's our story from the road. We have seen the Lord. I want you to take a little time at your tables right now and talk to each other with all of this stuff in your head, right? With baby Gus and the stuff we talked about with Mr. Rogers, all this stuff sort of floating around. How and where have you seen the Lord? We're in the Easter season. This is what we need to practice. How do you see the Lord? Where do you see the Lord? In your life, in your congregation, in your community? Go ahead and talk. All right, just one more minute. All right, thank you. So like I said in the first presentation, this kind of thing takes practice. Learning to see the world theologically takes practice because we're trained to do so differently, politically, economically, other ways. And that's why we need community so that we can practice the opportunity to be able to say what it is God is doing, where God is. I recently did a series with my congregation about Sabbath, which is great because I don't really know how to take Sabbath, and I really need to learn. It's critical now that I learn how to take Sabbath. And one of the things that I love that Luther says about Sabbath is you must do nothing with all of your might so that you can be reminded that it is God who works. We have to somehow make space for us to remember what it is that God is doing in the world. That photo that's in the last slide that I had up, that's also in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that's the structure that's built over the tomb. And when I was there was a lot of scaffolding, so I had to borrow the bishop's picture from when he went after that. So this is Eric's photo. And you walk around kind of in a line, and then you go in extremely quickly. You are ushered in and ushered out. But in that moment of being in that space, I don't think about what I had hoped that doesn't happen anymore. That's not going to happen. I am filled with hope for the future. And I hope that's what happens to us when we get together as Synod. I hope that's what happens to us when we come together in worship as a congregation. That we're not thinking about what had hoped that will never happen. We're thinking about what it is God might do that will surprise us when we are on the way, when we are on the move. So I need to say thank you to Phil and to Kyle and to the team for having invited me to do these. To Jason and to Aaron for helping me with my slides. Thank you very much. Thank you to Bishop Gronberg, because I know this has been a little bit of a haul the last couple of weeks with Easter and such. And I want to say thank you to John Hopkins for coming and leading us in music. And finally, I want to say thank you to you, because you take a risk going along with whoever the presenter is about what's this going to be like. And so having accompanied each other on this road, on this way, we trust that Jesus has shown up, that Jesus has changed us, that the Holy Spirit has done what the Holy Spirit will do, and that we will leave this place different than we came here, that bearing our light into the neighborhood, loving and struggling together for the sake of the gospel, we can say that we have seen the Lord. Let's end by singing. The last slide will have the words on it. John will play. So your part is the part in the bold, and John is the leader. So he'll start and he'll sing, and then we will sing the chorus. I missed it. This is a golden opportunity. It should have said Yell's part, and I missed it. Okay.
Let me show you how it goes. I'm going to sing, "We have seen the Lord," and you all sing, "We have seen the Lord." And then I go, God is mighty, and you do, "We have seen the Lord." God is powerful, we have seen the Lord. God with us, Jesus Christ. You got it. Good. Okay. We got it's a cappella except for my drum. We have seen the Lord.
We have seen the Lord.
God is mighty.
We have seen the Lord.
God is powerful.
We have seen the Lord. God with us, Jesus Christ.
We have seen the Lord.
We have seen the Lord.
God is lowly.
We have seen the Lord.
God is merciful.
What's that?
Okay.
Yes. Jesus Christ.
God is given. God is gracious.
We have seen the Lord.
God is wonderful.
We have seen the Lord.
God with us, Jesus Christ.